Hi, I'm Bob Noon. I'm the editor of the journal Family Systems, and I'm delighted today to have the opportunity to talk with Phil Klever, who is the author of one of the articles that will be published in the upcoming issue of Family Systems. And Phil has been one of the more prolific researchers and authors related to Bowen theory over the years. I've been impressed with the quality of his research and the stick-to-itiveness that he has demonstrated related to this research. So I guess where I'd like to start today, Phil, would be just if you could give a brief overview of your own research efforts over the years. I think it's been a very interesting one.
Sure. Yeah, it's been interesting for me too. It's really been stimulating intellectually, at times frustrating, of course, but really helpful in understanding Bowen theory more, to have to translate his concepts and hypotheses into defined ideas and measurements. So I started in 1994 with the overall basic research question of what contributes to variation in family functioning. So it was looking at the family as a unit. The first step was figuring out, how do I measure the functioning of a family unit? The way I went about it, which is just one way, there are other ways that one can go about looking at how do you measure the functioning of a unit. What I did was look at the level of symptomology based in the Bowen's concept of nuclear family emotional process. What were the symptomatic outcomes of the process? So I've been looking at physical, psychiatric, and social functioning of the adults and the kids, the degree of distance and conflict in the marriage. And the sum total of that would be, in my definition, reflecting how stable this family unit is, how much twitch there is over life and adapting. And so then I looked at some of the different variables that would influence how that unit was functioning. One would be the level of emotional cutoff and contact with the larger family, the nature of the primary triangle that the participants came from or were a part of. Another would be the degree of dysfunction or symptomology and stability in the multi-generational family, how that influences the family unit. Another would be the degree of goal direction and self-direction of the participants. That was a way to begin to pick up a piece of the ability to be individuals, to pursue something that's important to the individual. And then I looked at stress, basic challenges that were occurring over the course of the study in the multi-generational family. So that took the first 20 years or so. And that was where what I focused on were those research questions and ideas, and have written about those. And then I have shifted recently to looking at the family unit as a group itself and how it functions, and looking at the different nuclear family emotional processes within the nuclear family unit. And picking up again on Bowen's concept of the nuclear family emotional process. And the one I began, the first one that I've written about is this one for the paper for the Family Systems Journal. And that would be on the dysfunctional spouse process. And I chose to call it Divergent Spouse Functioning. To me, it's more representative of the reciprocal processes in the family, and especially in the couple. That was the reason I chose that term versus the dysfunctional spouse process, because it seems to put too much emphasis on just the dysfunctional spouse, and just the term does. So that's what
one of the things that in the article itself, you start out really kind of putting it in the context of a number of different areas, like, natural systems research. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I started off with the question for the paper was, what contributes to male and female, or two spouses, functioning differently from each other? And I looked at three bodies of research. One was natural systems, research. Another is research in marriage. And the third would be Bowen theory. So yes, I was looking at what do each of those bodies of thought have to say about how the relationships and the environment affect the functioning of the male and female. These all happen to be heterosexual couples, and almost all the research was about that, and not homosexual couples.
Could you say a little bit how you initially started this study and how you went about setting it up and structuring it?
How I started it?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a prospective study. You started from scratch, and then could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I started, as I said, in 1994, and I just began to form the hypotheses that I was mentioning. And so part of the work was figuring out how do I define these terms, these ideas that I was coming up with, and then putting them down on paper. And then there was the logistical part of recruiting couples. I recruited couples from throughout. They were within the first 3 years of marriage. I recruited them from throughout the Kansas City metropolitan area. Originally, there were about 76 couples that filled out or were interested in the study. And there were 51 couples that ended up being the couples that I followed over the 20 years, although I followed some of them, a smaller group for about 26 years. And when I say I'm following them, I would do an annual interview with them, and they would report about themselves, their kids, their parents, siblings, aunts and uncles, and grandparents. And a few years they talked about their cousins as well. I would ask about that too. So,
well, again, these were not clinical families. These were families that you sought out to be a research population, and it's kind of remarkable that they stayed with it over all these years. It's a pretty stable research population.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. I didn't know how that would go for sure. By the 15th year, there were 40 of the 51 couples that were still in the study. And when I say actually family units, because some of those were divorced and only one was reporting on the family. But so that was pretty good. And I think to be in the study, most of them had to have their lives enough together that they could fill out a questionnaire and take out an hour of their time for the interview. So it probably skewed a little bit more toward mid-range to higher functioning families, although I do have some families that are had quite a bit of struggle and challenge in their lives as well.
Could you say a little bit about this particular hypothesis that you were following up on? So when you described divergent spouse functioning, what were you looking at? And
well, I was looking at how I went about it was for my study, again, I was looking at the degree of symptomology. So each year I had the spouses reported about how they were doing, their health, their psychiatric functioning, and their social functioning. And so what I did for this paper is I took the first 15 years and I subtracted the husband's functioning from the wife's functioning, the overall degree of symptomology that they had. And when there was a difference in their functioning where one was more symptomatic than another, that was greater than the standard deviation, that qualified them as having a beginning level of divergent functioning. Interestingly, the majority of couples, most of the time, were within that range. So it was not the usual way that couples experience their life year to year, but it did emerge, and it was one of the ways that the nuclear family was showing that there was stress and challenge going on. So that's how I measured it.
I thought one of the interesting findings you had was that, looking at the overfunctioning, underfunctioning relationship or the dominant submissive, that whether one was dominant or submissive member of the marriage, that by itself wasn't an indication of who would become symptomatic.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. I mean, the idea would be that an overfunctioning, the dominant one in the marriage has the ability, of course, or can be susceptible to absorbing the most anxiety. It can be partly through taking on more of the sense of responsibility, having the children and the outside family, extended family being focused more on them. So they're kind of a target, the projection in the triangulation process. So yes, it could go either way. The natural systems research seems to uh, generally favor or suggest that the dominant one has an advantage in functioning. But of course, as Sapolsky talks about, that depends upon the condition of the group. When there's high stress, the dominant one has more reactive physiology. So a lot of this is dependent upon the condition that the family is operating in.
So so this study has been going on for 26 years. My guess is that it has allowed you to really get to know these families because of the extensive aspect of what you've been looking at in these families, both the nuclear family functioning and the extended families as well. And then you see them go through these various changes in their lives in terms of births and deaths and kids getting launched. It's really an interesting effort in terms of being able to watch these families evolve over a period of time.
Yeah, that has been an interesting thing to. It's different than a clinical practice. I have people I've seen over time, but in the research, these research families, I meet with them once a year. So it's been a relationship that has developed over time, and they have commented on it themselves that some of them look forward to the opportunity to. It's sort of a life review of the year for them to look at what has been happening, what's happening in their relationships, what kind of goals are they meeting or not. And so for them, I think that's been interesting. For me as well, it was when I decided to stop collecting data several years ago, that was a bit of a hard decision to let go because I wanted to know what's going to happen next. I wanted to see when the kids got married that I saw from birth on. I mean, I never saw the children, but I heard reports of them, and just to see how the next generation would evolve.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if you had some predictions and could somehow interview some of those families again. Have you ever thought about that? Or
Well, I have. If I had another life to live, it'd be fun to just follow the next generation.
in terms of looking at this divergent spouse functioning, this under functioning reciprocity operating in marriages, one of the things then you were looking at, as you mentioned, was the level of self-directedness that individuals had in a marriage relationship, and how that might impact on who becomes the more symptomatic one in the couple. Could you say a little bit about that, or what you found?
Yeah, to me, I think that's an important part of the concept of the dysfunctional spouse process that Bowen's very clear about, that there's a borrowing and trading of self would be the language that he would use, where one is in a position to be able to pursue goals more effectively, and the other one is less so. They're taking on more of the relationship challenge and burden and become more the target of the process of absorbing anxiety. And so that was one of the questions I was asking is, if there's a difference in the marriage and goal direction, does it influence the difference in symptomology? And in fact, there was a small association, but a statistically significant one that supported that idea. So that the partner who was able to be more effective in their goal direction tended to have less symptomology. Dr. Kerr mentioned that in his writing, that self-direction is a powerful anxiety moderator. So there's something about, how I would think about it, it provides a rudder in a way, as one is facing the challenges of life, and the lack of it as one is less able to be self-directed, less able to know where one's going, or less able to get there, it makes them more susceptible to absorbing the anxiety and developing symptoms.
Well, it's interesting because when the theory would posit that people tend to marry someone with equal levels of differentiation of self. So the being self-directed by itself isn't necessarily, or not being self-directed isn't necessarily a direct indication of levels of differentiation of self. Would you say, well, what are your thoughts about the overall proposition that people tend to marry someone of a similar level of differentiation of self after you've looked at this phenomenon of self-directedness?
Yeah, I would agree. I still think Bowen's idea that people marry at the same basic level of differentiation is accurate. It hasn't been proven. I think it's somewhat related, though it's not at all the same thing as a sort of mating. People marrying at same demographic levels. There's a certain affinity to marry at a similar level. Bowen is talking about a different aspect of this, of course, and I think couples do marry at a same basic level, but of course, there's in the idea of differentiation of self, you have functional levels of differentiation, so that you may marry at the same level, but then through the borrowing and trading of self, through the triangles, one can develop a more advantageous position and one a less so. In marriages, it can be a spouse focusing more on the vulnerability of the other, either being critical or feeling sorry for the other more. Those within the marriage, I think that kind of process helps to perpetuate this, and so that there's what it looks as though they're not functioning at the same level, but there's a difference there. And that was an interesting thing in the study, I think, was that when I looked at frequency of divergent functioning in couples over the 15 years, there were quite a few couples that 1 year it was the husband who is a bit less symptomatic, and then 2 years later it was the wife who was less symptomatic. And so there was some movement. I would see that as a sign of some flexibility in the pattern. It was not a fixed pattern. Whereas in other families, it stayed that way throughout the 15 years, where one appeared to be the higher functioning one, at least less symptomatic, and one consistently had the more difficulty in life.
Well, one of the things that's so interesting about this research study is that you've had this wealth of data, and then you've been able to pursue quite a few number of hypotheses related to developing the hypothesis and then testing it out by looking at the data from the research couples that you were looking at, or the families. And I don't know how many papers have you had published now related to this study? I mean, each one asking slightly different hypotheses. And
yeah, about 10 papers or chapters. Yeah.
So people are going to have to dig deep to get the full range of questions that you've been researching over the years. But they're going to have to get this next issue of Family Systems to read a little bit more about this topic of divergent family functioning. So thank you for this time to discuss this a little bit, Phil. And I'm sure that you're going to get quite a response from the readership of the journal. So
I hope so. I'm looking forward to that.
Okay. Take care, Phil.
Bye.